Welcome, everyone. Good evening. My name is Allie Kipe, and I'm happy to have you with us tonight for a conversation with Susan Campbell, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a widely read columnist, professor, and author of Tempest Tossed, The Spirit of Isabella Beecher Hooker. I am a museum educator at the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. We are the place where history and civics meet, and our goal is to share stories and ideas that help people understand our state and find ways to make it better. Tonight, we will discuss Isabella Beecher Hooker. Isabella was the youngest daughter of the fabulous Beecher family, one of America's most high-powered families of the 19th century. Older sister Harriet Beecher Stowe was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Brother Henry Ward Beecher was one of America's most influential ministers, and sister Catherine Beecher wrote pivotal works on women's rights and educational reform. And then there was Isabella Beecher Hooker, a curiously modern 19th century figure. Isabella, the leader, lecturer, and social activist in the American suffragist movement, was a woman ahead of her time. Isabella suffered from much public censure, yet she persisted in her activism. Susan and I will discuss how Isabella would fare in 2020 with social media and her temperament, in addition to Isabella's legacy and the impact she made in the world around her in the 19th century. If you have a question for Susan, please leave a comment on our Facebook video and she will answer it. Welcome, Susan. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Allie. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I gave a little bit of a background of who Isabella Beecher Hooker was and some of her siblings, but what was her family like and how did she fit into her family?
The press called them the fabulous Beechers, and this is going to sound inelegant, but they were, for people of my generation, they were like the Kennedys on crack. All of the men, all of the brothers were ministers, and that was a fairly high-powered position to hold at that time. Henry Ward Beecher was the best known. And a sort of modern-day equivalent would have been Billy Graham. Everybody knew Henry Ward Beecher. He was a fascinating person. You've already mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, who hasn't heard of her. Catherine Beecher was an educational reformer and kind of a Martha Stewart of her day. She wrote books on how to raise children and run a home. She never had children or owned a home, but she wrote books and traveled and spoke and was an independent woman of her own right. Isabella was the product of her father Lyman's second marriage. And the first wife, his first wife, Roxana Foote, was, from all indications, this incredibly progressive woman. Now, again, this was not Isabella's mother. And when she died in her early 40s, she left the family bereft. When Lyman went to Boston a year to the day that his first wife died to bring back his second wife, a woman also named Harriet Porter, the family was still reeling from that loss. And Harriet Porter was not necessarily, and this is going to sound unkind, up to the task of mothering these grieving children and being the wife of a small town but influential minister and running a house. She came from a lot of money. I'm not sure she thought through what being the wife of an influential but impoverished minister would be. And she pretty much took to her bedroom right after the marriage. We know Lyman visited because there was Isabella and her brother, but Isabella mostly grew up without her mother, but she had her older sisters as mother figures. Much was expected of the Beechers. That's one of the reasons they were known as the fabulous Beechers. And for all of Lyman's really interesting quirks, he insisted that his daughters were educated as were his sons. So his daughters were really the beneficiaries of this, again, fairly progressive approach. So everybody sat down at the table and argued. So Isabella had to learn to hold her own there. She was physically attractive, and in the fairly Calvinistic religious approach that some of the family members, certainly Lyman, had, that was a deficit. Because if you were beautiful, it was assumed you were also somehow shallow. So Isabella grew up trying to prove her credibility, basically, with her other siblings in ways that just, she did that her entire life. That was a long answer to a short question. I'm trying to make this answer shorter. But I'm talking about Isabella, and this is my favorite thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's her family is a huge part of her story. So ultimately, Isabella grows up and she marries John Hooker, a descendant of Thomas Hooker, one of the founders of the city of Hartford, and he pursues law. It seems like in this time period, well-to-do educated men either became lawyers or ministers. And he decided to become a lawyer. And she lives with him in Farmington. So that's a little bit of background that I have about how she ends up in Connecticut, but she does ultimately end up in Connecticut. And how does she become involved in the suffrage movement?
Sure. I can tell you, I'll try to be brief, how she ended up in Connecticut, because to me this is interesting. So she's growing up, and the family has moved to Ohio because Lyman got a job out there. And her older sisters were concerned because they thought that their younger sister was starting to worry too much about her hair and fashion. Well, she was 13, so of course she was. So they sent her back to Hartford to live with the really only private Beecher, Mary, who was married to Thomas Perkins, a lawyer in town. And she went from living in not poverty, but there wasn't a lot of extras, to basically an affluent home in Hartford. That's where John Hooker noticed her immediately and pretty much set his sights on her. But in between Ohio and Connecticut, she had been kind of farmed out to her older siblings, where she would stay for a while. And as with any younger sibling, if your younger sister is in your home and you have an argument with your husband, you're not necessarily going to take it into another room. She's going to see that. So Isabella formed from all those conversations she was a witness to the idea that marriage would not be for her, that she was a Beecher, she was an independent thinker. Her older sister, Catherine, had been able to support herself with writing and speaking. That's what she wanted to do. So when John Hooker began to woo her, she rebuffed him and told him she really didn't want to be anyone's wife. She didn't think she was a Beecher. She didn't want to be anyone's appendage. She was a Beecher. She was meant for bigger things. And he wore her down basically with a series of letters that are beautiful to read. And Harriet Beecher Stowe Center has them. And so it was so unromantic when she finally said yes. She said yes this way, that they could be engaged, but he wasn't to tell anyone. But if he got a better offer, take it. If he met a woman who suited him better within those 2 years, he by all means should marry her, because she's a Beecher. She was going to go to the public in some way. And so the 2 years are ticking by, and they're writing furious letters back and forth. And I've said this before, John Hooker needs a biography because he was so far ahead of his time. He educated her about the abolition movement, from which a lot of suffragists sprang. 2 years are coming up, and so Isabella writes him and says, well, the family's going to be in Hartford in August. We can get married then. Just like, that's the least romantic yes I've ever read about, but I love it. She became a suffragist, as I said briefly just now. So many suffragists cut their teeth on the abolition movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, you name it, Lucretia Mott, most of them started that way. And at the time, they were told, and this was the phrase that was used, that this was the Negro's hour, that they would get to the idea of women as equal citizens later, that women would get the vote, but that would have to come later. And then once the Emancipation Proclamation 1314 was passed, all these women who'd been involved in the abolition movement are looking around saying, okay, let's, Lawrence of Arabia, come on, let's go. And there's no one behind them. So it was really up to these women, some of whom were fairly savvy organizers, to build this movement on their own. Isabella was interested in this always. Again, she grew up thinking, hey, things aren't really fair to me as a female. I certainly don't want to get married. In fact, after she married John Hooker, she was reading Blackstone's commentary to him one night because he'd hurt his eyes going to Yale. He'd strained his eyes, so she would read his law books to him. So she was studying the law too. And she came across the part that described legally what happens to a woman when she got married, which is basically she disappears under her husband's right arm. And she threw the book across the study. This is ridiculous. And he had to remind her that that's not our marriage. If I wanted that, I would have gotten a dog. I want a marriage of equals. So it was a lifelong interest. And as she got older and she saw her older sister Harriet's success in writing, I think she began to tell herself, I think I need to be involved in this.
And what was one of the first turning points? Like, is there any sort of moments that stand out in her activism?
I think it was throwing Blackstone's commentary and then talking to her husband, who absolutely believed that women deserved equal rights. And then they had this gracious home in Nook Farm in Hartford, and they began any bold-faced name that came through Hartford would stay in their mansion, in their home. And she met all the big names and all the big thinkers, and everyone from spiritualists to feminists, suffragists would come through, and they'd stay in the home, and she would again educate herself by talking. And she was a voracious reader. So I couldn't say, oh, at this point, that's when she became a suffragist. I think she always was. The whole idea of disappearing into someone else's being was gross to her. And she and her husband, starting in 1870, began to address property rights in Connecticut, the Smith sisters of Glastonbury. There was no property rights if you were a woman. And they kept introducing and pushing this bill until it was finally passed in 1877. So that was one step along the road. But I think if there was a turning point, it was she saw she could be successful in something that she considered important. She got this legislation passed.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple questions. Brian Cofrancesco, he was wondering if you found any parallels between you and Isabella, and perhaps in your activism or philosophies.
Oh, Brian, I love you. Of course, I want to be her, but I think she was far more elegant and diplomatic. I think I too noticed early on that things weren't fair, and that still makes me very mad. I think we both probably took to writing because that seemed like one more platform where we could get our point across. But I'm not so full of myself to think if I got into a room with her that I could bring anything less than my A game to have a conversation with her. She made education her business, but I would love to think, oh, we're exactly alike. Nah, I'd be in the back.
What made you interested in Isabella? Like, what triggered your fascination?
It was a fluke, as is any large project I take on. I was working full time at the Current, and one of my colleagues there, Valerie Finholm, had the idea that 3 reporters would take the 3 public Beecher sisters and write bios of them, basically just do it turned out to be a special section, but do a series of articles. And she would take Catherine. I keep saying this, I may be making this up. I think I was sick the day they handed out the Beechers, and I got Isabella. My first thought was, no one's ever heard of her. And then my second thought was, so I can't really make a mistake because no one's ever heard of her. Whatever I say goes. And no one had ever heard of her. She had not been studied. She had been dismissed by history as the I'm sorry, this is terrible, the nutty Beecher sister who, just kind of spun her wheels and was rich and pretty, and what more do you need to know? But as the Stowe Center has more of her stuff than they do Harriet's, and I made it my business to move in over there, and they were wonderful. They just opened the door, and I got to touch clothing. It was great. But the more I read her, the more I thought she really was at the wrong time. She was absolutely a modern woman. She had ideas, and I would love to see her on Twitter. I would love to see her. I don't know if she'd do Facebook so much because that can be kind of tame. I would love to see her mix it up on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's one of my questions to you is what her favorite social media platform would have been and why. You say Twitter. Is it because it's concise? You couldn't see her Instagramming?
She may have had a hard time with concise. I would like to pull that back. I'm not sure about TikTok. I would say Maybe Instagram, although I have no evidence that she enjoyed photography at all. There are photos of her, but not many. Um, Maybe, yeah, stick with Twitter. Twitter tends to be more political, and I think she would have enjoyed going there. One thing I forgot to say to your last question is, so the three of us are dividing up the Beecher sisters, right? And I move into Stowe Center, and then the thing runs, and I find myself still going back to the Stowe Center. And someone there even asked, "Didn't that story run?" And I was like, "I know, I don't know why I'm here." And I kept collecting things and putting them in a computer file. And my husband and I were walking around Branford one Sunday. We don't live there, but we like to pretend we do. And there was a house with one of those placards, 1853. And I think he was talking about a boat he wanted to buy. We've been married a very long time. And I remember saying, "Oh, 1853. That's the year John and Isabella Beecher moved into their Hartford mansion. You're welcome." And it was like, I could see his shoulders slump. And he's like, "Oh my God, just write a book." As if that would make me stop talking about it. It didn't work. But it was like, oh yeah, I guess I kind of am. Right? Yeah, I'm an accidental author.
We have a question from, we actually have a few questions, but I'm sort of picking the ones that we can fold into our conversation. Mariana Garcia wants to know, like, or she's thinking, do you think Isabella could have been a YouTuber?
Oh, that's a great one. Why didn't I think of YouTube? Yeah, because Isabella had an ego, which makes me like her even more. And YouTube, good job. That's a good one. YouTube would have allowed her to film herself and let everyone hear her voice. Yeah, okay. I switched my original answer. YouTube. She would have been a YouTube. She would have been very popular on YouTube.
Was she confident?
Yes, no. She was confident. She was, what's the word they use to describe Kamala Harris and any woman who wants to be president or vice president? I can't even think of it. She was ambitious.
And aggressive, or that's what they would call.
Yeah, like that's a bad thing, right? Don't be ambitious. Right. But I would say she was ambitious. And at one point, she suggested she could be the president and kind of the matriarch of the country during a scandal involving Henry Ward Beecher. She suggested he step away from the pulpit. She'd step in and preach to this very large church in Brooklyn. I mean, she didn't lack for confidence. Mm-hmm. And yet, on the other hand, in her letters, there was a loneliness to her that I think sprang from she was one of a kind. And it's great to be ambitious and to be out there. But if you don't have kindred spirits to talk to, John was probably her as close to her best friend, kindred spirit. But like we talked about this briefly before the camera turned on, to have a girlfriend to go to and just say, "Oh my gosh, this happened." I don't know that she had that. What was the question, and did I answer it? Holy crap.
You did. We were talking about YouTube, and then I asked you what her confidence was like, and could you imagine her like putting her face on the internet and being comfortable with that?
She would have been very comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially if it was something that she cared about. Right.
And she actually had a lot of causes she cared about after abolition. Obviously, it was women getting the right to vote, but she also paid attention to poverty in the capital city. She wasn't as involved as she was in the suffrage movement. That was pretty all-encompassing, but she would write letters to the Current on they would stop running them, on everything from suffrage to poverty. There was one letter about where to find the best flowers in Hartford. She's all over the map, but yeah, she felt things very deeply.
Mm-hmm. Now, I have so many questions for you, and we do questions in the comments too, but I'd love to ask you, what did Isabella's activism look like? Did she protest? Did she meet with legislators? What were her main avenues?
She did not, to my knowledge, if she ever joined one of the protests, I didn't see that recorded. She tended to be much happier. She did give speeches, so I mean, if those became louder and more raucous than just a speech in a hall, okay. She was very good at lobbying, so she would talk to legislators. She went straight to the top, and there was one time she went to testify to a Senate hearing about the vote, And she didn't like the way the room was set up because, the senators were up here and she was down here. She made them all come down so she could go up so they could see her better. And she testified that way. She wrote like a fiend, not just letters to the editor, but she wrote magazine articles. She became an editor of sorts of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's speeches. They didn't much like her. They liked her money. They liked her financial support. But there were letters exchanged between Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony where it was sort of like, she's like a new convert. It's almost like you can't, it's like a yapping dog, stop it, because she was so excited to be involved. So her form of protesting wasn't so much, fist in the air, getting arrested, trying to vote when it was still illegal. It wasn't genteel, but it was more traditional methods.
Mm-hmm. Like she used what she already knew.
Yeah.
In order.
Yeah. She was comfortable. Like she'd get on a train and go places to speak, and she was completely comfortable doing that. And I get the sense she was a pretty good speaker. I've seen transcripts of the speeches, and she hit all the marks. Yeah.
Hmm. So, other than John, did she have any kindred spirits, people she felt she could really rely on and understood her?
Maybe a couple of her brothers were like her in that, but they weren't as outspoken as her. When Henry Ward Beecher was accused of sleeping with one of his parishioners, and he did, the family brought their wagons into a circle to protect him. All of them did that except Isabella. And do you have a friend who, they're wonderful, but they always say that one thing and you wish they'd stop talking just before that sentence? Like, you were going great. Why did you say that last thing? That was Isabella. And instead of, I highly recommend everyone look up Victoria Woodhull, Isabella Beecher Hooker. The rumors about the two of them potentially being lovers appear to me to be unfounded, but that's a quick way to dismiss someone, to start rumors about them. Anyway, during all this scandal, and it was a huge scandal, Isabella did not side with the family, and that created a rift that was never actually healed. So any attempt on her part to reach out and be close to her older sisters, not Mary so much, but certainly Catherine and Harriet, was not returned. So by taking a stand and saying he did it and he should apologize for it, which is probably what their father would have said, she was ostracized by the family. So I think she was kind of lonely.
Mm-hmm. Did she have any enemies? People who really outwardly just didn't like her?
Beyond her family, I don't know if her family was her enemies, but there were definitely anti-suffragists in Connecticut who really didn't like how she was throwing her heart, soul, and money behind the movement. But it wasn't like, Florence Griswold's firing salvos at her from down on the shore. But there were definitely people who thought she was trying to be a man, be political.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Rebecca. What was the most surprising thing that you learned about Isabella?
There were so many. So she was so much a part of my life for 5 years that even answering questions like this, there's a part of my brain going, yeah, but the better you know someone, the harder it is to give definitive answers. What I kept coming back to, what kept me researching her when there was, I don't know what I'm doing, but this woman is fascinating, was that she would be a kindred spirit to a lot of us now. And she was in the wrong time. And I just kept not feeling sorry for her, but wanting to reach out and tell her, it's going to be okay. That sounds so weird. She was a spiritualist, and I did have a seance and may or may not have reached her. But the idea that what didn't surprise me was her obstinance and her firm belief that women could handle politics and that they would not be besmirched by getting into the political arena, both as candidates and as voters. What surprised me was how very many times she got knocked down and was censored, and she got back up. Where somebody would say something horrible about her or start a rumor about her, that happened a lot. And she would, get knocked down, feel terrible, and then brush off her skirts and get back up. And I just found that to be surprising, in that how many of us, you get called something on Facebook and you go, oh my God, I got it. No, you brush off your skirts and you get back up. That I found surprising. That told me she had major backbone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So where did that the rumors and things like that, where did that come from?
Sometimes her family. Her family started a rumor that she had lost her mind. And having read so much of what she said and felt up to her death, I don't see it. She was ostracized for being a spiritualist, even while her husband, John Hooker, was every bit as committed a spiritualist. He too believed that the veil between living and dead was fairly thin, and you could talk to spirits. So did Abraham Lincoln's wife. Abraham Lincoln went to seances, and yet Isabella was censored because she was Isabella. And it's almost like, you have a plank of wood, and any little piece that sticks up, you have to sand it down. So anything she did that wasn't the patrician notion of wealthy Hartford, you have to sand it down. And it must have been exhausting to her. I was exhausted reading it.
Yeah. I didn't know all that about her, sort of like having haters and them being her own family members.
Yeah, and it's probably, I don't necessarily think they hated her. I think they were frustrated with her, because you have this enterprise, the Beecher enterprise, and someone messes up, and what do? You do crisis communication. Oh, he never could have slept with that parishioner. He's a man of God, and you just keep repeating that. And you have already a wonderful reputation as a very involved family. And then you've got this one piece of wood sticking up saying, he did it. He did it. He should repent. He needs to apologize. And that took on this whole life of its own.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking over my questions. We do have a couple in the comments too. I think this is an interesting question. Do you think, and I think what Mariana is asking here, so she says, do you see Isabella having married any other man besides John? So that could either mean, was there another suitor, or could she have been with like a mousy guy who didn't do anything?
No. And I love that question, because I do believe there's more than one person out there for everyone, unless you're Isabella Beecher Hooker. And then I think she absolutely married the right man. She would not have married a mousy guy. She would have rolled right past him. She probably wouldn't have noticed he was there. And she did have young men paying attention to her, and she did not. It was like, I'm walking over here, you're over there, you're not there to me. But it was John Hooker's persistence and his appreciation for her as a separate entity. I don't know how many men like that she could have found in her fairly small world. So, however, I have no evidence that there were other lovers in her life, and I have no evidence that she should have married anyone but John Hooker. Someone write a book on him. Just do it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, it sounds like she needed to be with the strong man, but was he reserved? Like, what was his temperament like?
He was, I wouldn't call him reserved. He grew up, his father ran a school in Farmington. He did not grow up poor as a member of the Hooker family. So he wasn't used to want. He was smart. He gave wonderful speeches. I think he was a man very much comfortable with himself and his time. He wasn't bombastic, but I wouldn't have called him reserved. Mm-hmm. It sounds like we just talked, John and I. We're so close.
Okay, this is a good one. Women finally earned the right to vote in 1920, 13 years after Isabella's death. Was she recognized for her contributions when women earned the right to vote?
Not so much, and not really even much now. And every time there's Connecticut and suffrage mentioned somewhere, I always look to see if her name is in there. And it's still, there were a lot of women whose stories just kind of, well, you work at the old state house, just kind of drifted away as if they never happened. And it's unfortunate. At the time, she had pulled back as she got older and was not nearly as involved. And after John died a few years before she did, she really pulled back from a lot of things. So there was that working against her. But I always have found it sad that all the big names of that era died before they could vote. And I really hope they were in heaven having Sherry the day the amendment was ratified, because all that they did and all the, again, public censure that all of them dealt with, and the troubles in their own homes, because of course they're out speaking and organizing, and they did it. And we know Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony. We know 5 or 6 by name, and so many others were, not just Isabella, but so many others were involved. So I didn't see a lot about her at the time of suffrage.
What were Isabella's main arguments as to why women should have the right to vote? Is there anything reason she really cared about it?
Women are people. Women are smart. You're ignoring 51% of the population when you don't let them vote. Same as now.
Before women had the right to vote, how would someone like Isabella use her voice, or how would she exercise her voice if she couldn't vote?
She had more of a voice than some. Through her writing and her speaking, most women had to rely on their husbands being their voice. Now that worked okay, I guess, if you agree or your husband agreed with you, but in the end, the man in the house had the political voice. Because Isabella was so out there with her speaking and her writing, she started to get letters from women in Connecticut, actually around the country, who did not have a voice. And I remember one was from a farmer's wife, and she described her life. She was the second wife of an old grizzled farmer somewhere in Connecticut. I can't remember where now. And her life just sounded like total awful servitude. And it was basically, this letter writer was encouraging Isabella, because that was not a life. So if you had a brain and you could look around and think, well, I might have something to add here, but you have no venue to add, what a horrible, horrible life.
We have a question from Brian.
Brian.
You mentioned Isabella was active fighting poverty in the capital city. What did she do to fight poverty, and how does that relate to your own activism around homelessness?
Stop bringing it back to me, Brian. When I say fight, if I said that, that's overstating it. But she did write about that, and she did try to draw attention. And at that time, I think she did what was more traditional for someone of her status in society. Was she gave away a lot of money, and not just at Christmas time. And people would come to the door, and she would give away money. And part of that was Christian charity, but part of that was she felt guilty because suddenly she has money, and she didn't really have a lot to start with, and she wasn't trained to run a household and have servants or anything like that. The way it relates to mine is I don't have that much money to give, but I think I share with Isabella that notion that things could be a lot more fair. And if we make them fair, those of us who are privileged to have enough or more than enough, we're not going to lose out on anything. It's not like a pie. And that none of us, and I think this is from Isabella, none of us should be all that comfortable while people go in need.
Mm-hmm. So this is changing gears a little bit, actually going back to John Hooker. John Hooker purchased James Pennington's freedom. So James Pennington was he was enslaved, and he basically ran away, I believe, and ended up in Connecticut, and he served as a pastor at the Talcott Street Church, which stood on Talcott Street in Hartford, and now it's the Faith Congregational Church. But I was wondering if Isabella had any role in that purchase, if you know. Or
I've never seen anything that connects, but it is a little window into John Hooker, so it's pretty cool. John Hooker wrote an autobiography that's pretty much unreadable, but he devoted a lot of time to that purchase. He purchased the servitude of John Pennington so he could turn him loose, so that he could free him, turn him loose.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to free this man. This man had run up here from Maryland and then assumed another identity, studied, was a minister. And if I remember correctly, his former purported owner found him and wanted him brought back, and friends sent Reverend Pennington to Germany, to Europe to study some more. I mean, the man had multiple degrees. And finally, John Hooker worked out that he would purchase, the purported owner died, but he would purchase Reverend Pennington from the estate. And it was weird because he said he held on to that document for a day to see what it was like to own a person. And it was awful. And then there was a big to-do, and Reverend Pennington came home and John Hooker attended, and it was a big party. But I don't think he would have done that counter to anything Isabella would have wanted. I'm sure he did that with her full-throated support, but there's nothing that I've ever seen where she said, do this. This was John Hooker doing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's just a cool intersection, because James Pennington played a really big role in helping the Amistad Africans after they gained their freedom, helping them to go back to Africa. So he has strong connections here at the Old State House. We have a question from Sarah Jean Watson-Willett. She says, you mentioned that Isabella didn't have many good female friends. Did she have any early on when she lived in Farmington?
There is very little written about Isabella's time in Farmington. She married John Hooker very young, and then they moved into his parents' home. And I saw I'm sure she was keeping track. I saw no letters where she referred to her in-laws, or I would hope that they would have, as a young couple and young up-and-coming couple. They built their home in Hereford and moved there in 1853. And I don't want to paint it like she's a sad woman in the Belfry or anything, but I don't know what her friendship situation was like when she was newly married.
Yeah. Well, female friendship, like in a historical sense, has always been sort of fuzzy to kind of figure out.
Yeah, and then people ascribe feelings to language that's far more flowery than certainly any note I'd send to a girlfriend. And it's sad because it would be nice to know, not just Isabella Beecher Hooker, but other women. How did you correspond with each other?
Mm-hmm.
How did you bond?
Mm-hmm. This is a good question. If I can remember which one it is. Okay, how has Isabella influenced you, and how you approach changing problems that you see in our society?
I think by far, I've not learned to be diplomatic from her, and that would be a great lesson, but I'm 62 next birthday, and it's probably too late. But the whole idea of you will be, if you're sticking up, if your head's sticking up a little bit, someone's going to try and sand you down, and you will be publicly censored. And on social media, you may be taken and tied up into stocks and have tomatoes thrown at you. Just brush off your skirt and get back up. If you really believe in what you're saying and doing, then internet trolls and all that, they don't matter. They really don't matter. But what matters is the message you're trying to share, or the goal you've set for your town or your representatives, or you yourself if you run for office. That, of course, there's going to be people who disagree with you. That's the world, and some of them are really unpleasant. They don't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian wants to know that if you had 10 minutes with Isabella and could ask her one question, what would it be?
So I had a seance with her. Brian and I are going to have a seance one of these days. And I wanted to ask, how's my research going? Am I missing anything? But I don't think I'd ever want to ask her, did you like my book? Because I couldn't stand it if she didn't. I would want to ask her, were you happy? Were you happy? Because she was such an activist and such an A to B, B to C kind of person. And she was an unsure of herself mother, again, not having grown up with her mother in her life much. Her mother died when she was a early teenager. Were you ever happy? Because I want to believe she was, and I'm sure she was, but she tended to focus on the issue at hand in her writing and her speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't
Now,
have how the book went.
could you talk a little bit about her experience as a mother? How many children did she have, and where did they end up?
She had 3, and she had a really good relationship with her younger Edward, who was a homeopathic doctor, and he stayed with her forever. Alice, her middle daughter, they bumped heads, I think, because Alice was very much like her, headstrong. In one of Isabella Beecher Hooker kept what she called motherhood journals, where she just wrote the most inane minutia. And in one of them, in regard to Alice, she said that she had sinned with her tongue. She yelled at her. I'm glad I didn't have to write down every time I did that. And then the older one, Mary, with whom she was very close. None of them took up the activist mantle, but it was a fairly cohesive, I mean, she and Alice bumped heads her entire life, but it was a fairly cohesive family. But she never knew if she was doing the right thing. And she worried that she really agonized over whether she was a good mother. And then as she got older, it was sort of, well, I don't have to worry about that so much. And that gave her the license to throw herself more into activism.
Mm-hmm. How was John as the father?
I think, Isabella's father, Lyman, would get on the floor and play with kids, his children. I mean, he was this big time minister, but he was very much childlike in some ways. John, I think, was very similar to that. Like, he could be very formal, but those were his children, and I think he loved them inordinately.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right word? Let's say it is.
So we've talked a lot about Isabella's activism around suffrage, women's suffrage, and abolition and poverty. Are there any other movements that she really felt passionate about?
Spiritualism. She felt
Yeah.
passion, and a lot of people did at the time. And imagine the time, especially during and post Civil War. So many young men had died in the war, and what mother wouldn't want one more time to talk to their son, one more time? And spiritualism offered that, and she embraced it and was dismissed for it. In fact, there was an argument over her will when she died, and one of the current headlines was Mrs. Hooker talks to spirits. Really? Really? That's mean. Um, and it was always, publicly that was always dismissed, but it was very popular. She wasn't the only person. I think where she crossed a line for some people is people could dabble in spiritualism, and Isabella dabbled in nothing. It was all in. So she was an adamant spiritualist and very interested in that movement.
Why do you think she was so interested in spiritualism?
I've read a couple of things on that and her, and I think spiritualism is not a hierarchical religion. There's no, bishop. There's not even seriously. I mean, there's clergy, but that appealed to her. The idea that she could be treated as an equal, and spiritualism was very popular for that reason with a lot of women. That it was a very egalitarian approach to spirituality.
Mm-hmm. And this question kind of relates to what we're talking about. My question is, how does society remember Isabella Beecher Hooker, and how should she be remembered?
I think she, like I said earlier, like so many women and men involved in the suffrage movement, they've just sort of dissipated. Their memory is gone. I wish for her and so many others that we would at least give a nod to all these worker bees who were in there battling. And, you cannot get votes for an entire group of people on the backs of 5 people, the 5 or 6 names most people, or 3 or 4 names most people can recall. You had all these regional leaders. You had other organizations that stepped in toward the end and really made the difference. The Women's Temperance Union, who knew they'd care? But I wish that people would remember Isabella as someone who fought hard, fought fair, and kept getting up. That would be awesome.
Mm-hmm. And her memory though lots of people, I will say probably around the world, might not recognize her name. Locally, unfortunately, she's remembered for sort of one thing and one thing only, right? And that's the spiritualism. So that's really unfortunate.
It really is. And when I started researching, the first thing I did was go out and see how have other historians, I don't consider myself a historian, how have historians treated her when they mention her briefly? And it was always the tragic Isabella, the not quite there Isabella, the crazy Isabella. And, that's a really quick and dirty way to dismiss someone. Well, they don't have it all together, so we don't have to pay attention to her or him. If that had been the case, we still could pay attention to her. But that was just mean. And that hurt her. That hurt her feelings, that people could dismiss her as not smart or mentally ill and not listen to her.
Did it get worse as she got older? Or did it calm down as she got older?
It calmed down when she started backing away, when the objective was reached to quiet her down. That didn't calm her down. I think she backed away. Like I said, after John died, a lot of air went out of the balloon. And then as she got older, she had some health issues. So barnstorming around the state in a car was a little bit beyond her. She would keep attending annual meetings of the suffrage groups in Connecticut. But people stopped picking on her when she stopped talking.
We have a question from Rebecca. Do you think there could be a second book on Isabella?
Yes, all the stuff I wished I'd put in. The first speech I gave after the book came out, somebody shared an anecdote, and I'm like, crud, that would have been good in there. Yes, probably a more scholarly book. Mine is not scholarly. It's just like, hey, listen to this. This is really cool. She's a really interesting person. I would love to see her start to show up in more scholarly treatments of that time and of that place, because she's a serious person. And I don't think I'll write a second one. I can't seem to stop talking about her, so it may come to that, but, shoot me.
Are there descendants of the Beechers who made an impact in activist causes?
I'm sure they have. I don't know. I've met some, and I met one great-great-granddaughter who looks exactly like her. In fact, I gave a speech, and I had a little tap on my arm, and I turned and was like, oh, my God. I thought she'd come back dressed in modern garb. And the woman, the way she talked and presented herself, I just followed her around like a puppy. I don't know that she's an activist. She's an artist. I know that the Beechers had and have a family reunion that I tried to crash one year unsuccessfully. They're a fairly high-powered family, but I don't know their activism. I don't know what they do.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time since Isabella was alive, so I'm sure there are lots and lots of Beechers.
Yeah, but I mean, the New York Times had this great photo spread of descendants from the early suffrage movement, and it was cool because every last one of them was somehow involved in human rights issues.
Now, I have to ask this question because so many people have either heard of or maybe read Uncle Tom's Cabin. What was her relationship like with Harriet Beecher Stowe?
So this was before the scandal, right? Isabella was justifiably jealous of her sister. I think here comes the confidence again. Isabella thought she could be a pretty good writer. She loved that her sister was successful and supported her sister. But there are a few little asides in letters to family members, and they were vociferous letter writers that were not digs at Harriet, but basically, I can write too. Well, yeah, maybe you can, but you may not change the world with your book. Your sister did. That's really hard to compete against. Even after the scandal, I think they all loved each other. But I think if you got eight Beechers in a room, you had 12 egos. I mean, they were just, most of them, fairly confident in their place in the world.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, this isn't so much information about the Beecher family. So I'm thinking a lot about letter writing because I wish we still wrote letters and we don't.
I do. I write letters.
Really?
I love writing letters. Every day I write Donald Trump, my Aunt Julie, and my Aunt Susan. Not every day, every other day. Donald Trump.
So she wrote a lot of letters to other people, and she also wrote them through her activism. Do you think that we should sort of, we've talked a lot about Isabella being in our time. Do you think that there would be any benefit of us sort of taking on some of her activist choices?
Yeah, her mode of her mode of communication, I would highly recommend it. A letter gets read, an email, not so much. A text, how deep are you going to get into an issue with a text? I'm a big fan of letter writing. Letters can be saved. I know emails can be saved too, but how many emails moved you to the point where you put them in a file so you could go back and read them? I've not gotten an email like that. I would love to see more letter writing. That would support our wonderful postal service, but I would also love to see letter writing because your brain does a different thing when you're writing a letter, whether you do it by hand or type it. Your brain thinks differently than if, like me, you're firing off an email that you don't edit. You know, it's a little more serious. That would be wonderful. I think she'd still be writing letters in reference to what social media she'd be on. Yes, YouTube. I don't know how. I mean, I assume she would learn all the technology because for her that would be one more way of getting her point across. But I'm pretty sure she'd still write letters.
Yeah, I think it would be cool if everybody nowadays was writing letters. People in my generation, as far as I know, don't.
Well, to be honest, even in mine, and I'm 100 years old, they don't write letters, but I always was distant from family members I liked best. The ones I couldn't stand, I lived with. So the ones who were distant, I would write letters to from the time I could hold a big fat pencil. It was a way to, because certainly you're not going to pay for long distance to call someone in Kansas City, my God. So I'd write them letters. And I've never really stopped doing that. I mean, I've outlived a great aunt. She died in Arkansas. I don't write her anymore. When my dad died, I stopped writing him, but I always find someone else I can write.
Yeah,
it's a way to communicate that I think is really valid and valuable. Write letters.
Yeah, support the postal service.
Absolutely, and get some beautiful stamps to go.
Yeah. So, what do you think? Why I keep losing my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Welcome to the world. You're halfway through the sentence and you're like, why am I here? I don't know.
No, yeah, you've been doing great though. I'm like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of.
This is easy. I'm just answering questions. You're trying to listen to me, then come up with a question. I interview people for a living. It's not that easy.
Yeah, my question is, it came to me. I remember it. So, what movements do you think she would be most involved in today?
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter, because I think she would see the importance of that. And again, going back, I think she would understand that making things fair did not mean a diminution of her resources and what she had available to her. I think she would understand that it's time, it's past time. And I'm pretty sure that might be protests she would attend, mask and all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in a heartbeat.
Yeah. And do you think, was she involved in before she could vote? She couldn't vote because she passed away before suffrage was given to women. Was she involved in the electoral process at all?
Because they were a high-powered couple, they had friends who were state senators in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. And I mentioned the property bill that became law because they wrote it and the Clippers pushed it through. So yes, she was. I never saw evidence that she overtly campaigned for anyone. I know they had dinners in their home and they would have to, kind of like fundraisers for politicians, but there wasn't an active knocking on doors kind of thing. They did it anyway back then.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm just wondering because if she lived in 2020, she would have the right to vote. So do you think she would most definitely be involved in electoral politics?
She would have run for office probably starting once her children got older. I think she would have felt an obligation to get them through whatever they had to go through. She would have run for a court of common council in Hartford. I think she would have eventually had her eye on a state seat. And I don't think, given that she mentioned she'd make a great president, that she would look at the U.S. Senate as a bridge too far. She would run for office.
She would run for office.
She would win. Yeah.
I would vote for Isabella.
I would totally vote for her, and I would want to work on her campaign so that when the rumors started, we could squash them like a bug. But we're not doing that. We're not talking about that. We're going to talk about the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people that probably, love talking about her spiritualism and stuff like that because it brought the eye away from the issues at hand.
Exactly, because if we can talk about her nutty spiritualism, we don't have to really examine what she's saying about making things fair for women.
Absolutely.
You can go off on this tangent, down this rabbit hole, and wonder at her mental health and just never get to the point, huh?
Yeah. We have just a few more minutes, but Sarah Jean wants to know which address can letters to Susan be sent?
Which address, I'm sorry, to me?
Yeah, like if someone wanted to write you a letter.
Oh, cool. Is it weird to give out my home address? Probably. Okay, I'll give out my work address. What is my work address? University of New Haven, 300 Boston Post Road, West Haven, Connecticut, 06516, probably.
Cool.
Super probably. I answer letters. I answer mean letters. I don't get a lot of kind letters. So a kind letter would be cool, but if you want to write a mean letter, I'll answer.
That's awesome. So before I share some information about some upcoming events, Susan, is there anything going on in your world that you'd like to share with the audience?
Just everyone, this is a horrible summer, a horrible pandemic. Stay safe. Don't be stupid. Wear a mask. Keep your distance, and we'll get through it. That's all.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm just going to take a minute now. We have a couple events coming up this month. So on August 20th, we have a conversation at noon with National History Teacher of the Year finalist Karen Cook, where she's going to talk about Abraham Lincoln visiting Connecticut after his famous Cooper Union address in February of 1860. And he used a snake metaphor that went directly to the heart of the moral question of slavery in a speech he gave here in Connecticut. So Karen Cook is going to talk about Abraham Lincoln here in Connecticut. And then on August, and that's at 12 p.m. and it will be a Facebook live event just like this one. And then we have landmark legislation. That's a conversation with Professor Dominic Debrincat of Missouri Western State University and Mariana Garcia, museum educator, where they're going to discuss the outbreaks of Connecticut's past and state laws in response to pandemics.
Ooh,
so
those are cool.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
I'll let you ask my opinion, but those are cool.
Yeah, no, they should be really good. And it was so awesome talking to you this evening, Susan. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. Everyone, be cool.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.